Exactly 50 years ago, the Newark Riots, they were raging. In some ways, that city is still scarred by that event. We're going to talk to a filmmaker who looked at Newark then and now. Then the latest developments on Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with the Russians, and there are more updates. Now it's Russians plural, as we're learning more people were in fact in the room, not just the attorney we had already been told about. Also, the author of a new book on Hillary Clinton's stunning defeat. It's called Shattered, and it tells an inside account. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Those segments and much more in a packed hour ahead. Now, we begin tonight, though, with the Newark Riots, which were exploding exactly 50 years ago. It all started on July 12th, 1967. That when two white police officers arrested a black cab driver. The officers beat up the cabbie, but a rumor had circulated that they killed him. In fact, they hadn't. But that lit a fuse, and it started 4 days of street violence. National Guard called in. 26 people would die before the riots ended. More than 700 others were injured. 1,500 arrests were made. And the city, it was scarred for decades. Tens of thousands of people, they fled the city, and Newark became a national symbol of urban decay. Now, the city has come a long way since then, but it does struggle to continue. A documentary called Riot takes a look back at 1967 and also what is going on today. Here is a clip from it.
As the world watches trouble spots like Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, and wonders what will happen next, the people of Newark, New Jersey don't have to guess. For 50 years, they've lived with the specter of 5 days of conflict that left 26 people dead and destroyed a large portion of their city.
There were people here who had been stripped of their rights, who faced implacable walls of bigotry.
I think when you back anyone up against a wall and they feel helpless, they will strike back, they will fight back, they will riot.
And we're now very pleased to be joined by Kevin McLaughlin. Kevin's the producer and director of Riot. Also with us, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. First of all, welcome.
Thank you.
This film had a special meaning to you. Talk about roots in Newark, not just for yourself, but your family.
Right. Well, my family goes in Newark back to the early 1920s, I guess. My dad was a fireman in Newark. I grew up in the Vailsburg section of Newark, which has its own little history, and there's a chapter on that in this film as well, because I felt like that was one of the areas that was most affected long term, and that was the view I took that people don't always take when they do a historical piece. What happened after, the many, many effects that went for decades after. And you can still walk down streets in Newark and see empty lots that have been that way since buildings burned down in 1967.
And before we get to what happened in the 5 days and what happened after, it's instructive to know, and I got that in looking at your film and also some of the research for this, people always, when you hear the riots, the Newark Riots. Well, almost around exactly the same time, you had riots in Harlem, you had riots in Watts and in L.A., you had riots in Detroit. You also had riots in places like Plainfield, New Jersey. Right. There were pockets in New Jersey that were in flames. It wasn't just Newark. And while there was, as we detailed off the top, a misrepresentation about what happened that may have sparked this riot, there was a fuse waiting to be lit.
Sure, all over America, because there was, it was time for something to change. There were a lot of people who were just being repressed and reached a point where something had to give. And I wouldn't say there were any real innocent parties involved. There was a lot of guilt to go around, and a lot of mistakes made by people from all walks of life that kind of came together and just sort of exploded. Not only in Newark, but like you said, in other places. Asbury Park, New Jersey is another one that had pretty extensive rioting as well.
It was described in many cases as people would look at it and it was just a big red glowing object was Newark from a distance. It was a war zone. I want to play another clip from your documentary, from reactions from people, from what they were witnessing firsthand.
I remember it as if it were yesterday. It was the 13th of July, and some guy drove a car right into Flax's furniture store, and the looting began.
When I became a fireman, I knew that it was difficult, physical, dangerous work at times, but I never suspected that I would ever be shot at.
My mother was so afraid because she got 8 kids. She had us under the bed hiding. I remember bullets and stuff coming through.
They were going in apartments and they were actually shooting through the floors, which is the intention that they were meaning to kill people.
You know, Kevin, it was described that there was almost the first 3 days of the riots and the second 3 days. First 3 days, it was pure anarchy. There was looting, there was firing, and then the National Guard and all of the law enforcement pushed back, and some would say they pushed back even harder. But just talk about the pure chaos that enveloped the city in the beginning here. And we said a lot of people not only killed, a lot of people injured, tons of arrests. And there was innocents that were caught up, including a firefighter who was literally shot in the back responding to one of the fires. But just talk about the madness, particularly in the first half of it, before some argue there was an over-response.
Right. Well, the biggest difference between the first half and the second half was that nobody was killed in the first half. And that's an interesting point that was mentioned by a number of people I spoke with, that there were no deaths until the National Guard and the state police came in. And it's still being debated extensively who shot all those people.
Yep.
There were no autopsies of 26 people, so that tells you something. I don't think that would happen today, but there was certainly, I think, some effort to keep quiet as to where all those bullets came from. And there's, on the other hand, there's statistics that went around about how many thousands of rounds were fired by the state police and the National Guard, and I've been told that that's a figure of how many rounds of ammunition were handed out to them. But state police, for example, were required to go for shooting, I don't know what they call it, when you have to go and prove that you can shoot every so many times a year.
The National Guardsmen went in there completely untrained and unprepared for it.
But they had to supply their own ammunition, so if they could get it for free,
guys
they
are saying
took it
they
home.
literally bring shotguns from home when they went in there, and there was literally tanks rolling down Main Street in Newark. I want to play another clip talking about the response of the National Guard and how, at least in some eyes, how heavy-handed it was.
The National Guard, they were very serious, man. They were like, don't move. And people was moving, and they were shooting.
They would return fire on this high-rise, and I mean hundreds of rounds of ammunition. These are steel ball, armor-piercing rounds. They will go through a brick wall.
A whole city on fire. It looked like London in 1940 during the course of the London Blitz.
And we get to where we were in the immediate aftermath, and today you were seeing some white flight from Newark even before the riots, but it was an accelerant. As soon as that happened, the city cleared out of a large part of the white population. I mean, you know this firsthand.
Yes, I think a lot of people were a little concerned about where the city was headed before that. But once that happened, as one person in the film says, now people knew what could happen, and it could happen again, and they didn't really want to be a part of it. On the other hand, I spoke with a priest who was the pastor at Sacred Heart in Vailsburg, and he said people came to him with a moral issue. I don't want to abandon my city, but I'm afraid I'm going to lose my life savings. It was a big, hard thing for them.
And to the scars that we see today in Newark, you see some abandoned lots. There has been comebacks. I know you interviewed every mayor from '67 to present about Newark. It's funny, the current mayor, Mayor Baraka, his father was a civil rights activist. Some say crossed many a line also in the process of doing that. And now he's the head of the city that he's trying to still heal and bring back. There's a greater representation. I think it's something like 40% Hispanic, 30-some-odd% African American on the police force, and the balance being white, which was flipped completely as an inverse 50 years ago.
Right.
But also they want some of those same people who left to come back, or at least some of the businesses to come back. So it's kind of, they're caught in the middle right now as a city.
Yeah, it's a tough sell, I think, but it's coming a long way. If you go through downtown Newark now during the day, it's really nice. It's just like any other thriving city. But you go down there at 8 o'clock at night and it's a ghost town because people work there and then they leave. Sharp James told me a story about when the Panasonic office building opened up and they had a big event, and somebody got up and said, everybody from Newark cheer, and like 3 people clapped because they're all from outside of town. They need to get it to the point where the jobs are taken by people who live couple blocks away.
We've seen gentrifications in parts of Hoboken and Jersey City, and a lot of people are waiting for that still to happen to Newark, which is the biggest city, obviously, in New Jersey. And as a person who grew up in New Jersey, it was always Newark's the hub. You know, whenever the team won or anything from New Jersey, where do you do the parade? Remember, it's Newark, but yet that lingering impact, even if people weren't around from 50 years ago, it's still there.
You know, it's funny. It wasn't quite the hub. When there were championships, they usually happened at the Meadowlands. I was a suburban kid. I grew up in Central Jersey. We avoided Newark. I mean, it was South Bronx in the 70s was the impression that we had of Newark in the mid 80s, right or wrong. And it's only been with the regentrification of parts of Newark that I think it's opened up in a lot of different ways. I mean, Newark was stigmatized within New Jersey for a long time.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm curious, if I may, the comparison between the beginning of the Newark riot and what we saw in Ferguson and what we saw in Baltimore, starting with a difficult police interaction and spreading. Was this film in process already when Ferguson happened and when we saw these flashes again? And did you immediately flash back to the Newark riots when you saw what was happening?
Yeah, this was in the works well before any of those things happened. And you know, if you pay attention, these sort of things do happen all around from time to time, and those were a couple that just kind of caught the national eye and got a lot of press. But that's another reason I wanted to do this, to kind of help people understand what happens in an extreme case where both sides kind of get out of control and people get hurt.
You know, Dominic, I know you go around the country speaking, and also you go to communities, you know, that have faced some of the same poverty levels that you could argue were a tinderbox to this. But what's different now and then, at least, is it was so clear there was a white power structure from both officials, law enforcement on down. Now it's different, particularly in urban areas where you'll see representation, whether it be in the mayor's office or in the police department, et cetera, where it's not as much of a clear us and them. And I know it speaks to that also in the film, but some of the same seeds that we saw 50 years ago we do now. When there's an absence of hope and nothing to lose, that's when things get really dangerous.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, what happened 50 years ago in Newark, Richard, as a person of color, as the only person of color at this table, I'm telling you, many of the same situations that sparked the riots back then exist today. The fact of the matter is, I believe there are roughly 420, give or take, African-American elected officials around the country. That is progress. But still, in many areas, it's a predominantly white police force, in which it's a similar situation where it almost happened in Ferguson. And I was looking at some of the pictures from 50 years ago in Newark. Take a tank rolling down the street. Well, that happened just a year ago in Ferguson, Missouri. So the problem, okay, here's the good news, Richard. Here's what I'm trying to say. So what have we learned from all of this? So like the NYPD, they now have an entire unit, the Community Affairs Department, that whenever there's a questionable shooting, they push these officers out there to have great community relations immediately. And the reason why they do that, Richard, because we can stand here and put a Band-Aid on it and act like everything is perfect. Many of the conditions that existed were blacks. I listened to Senator Cory Booker and Mayor Sharp James talking about blacks felt like their backs were up against the wall. Well, guess what? In the year 2017, it's exactly the same thing.
And as we said, you know, 5 nights, 50 years, and still you have some of those lingering scars. Kevin, I'm sure a lot of people watching, including a lot of folks in Jersey, would love to see this. How can they go about seeing this documentary?
That's something I'm working on. I have multiple distributors that are interested in it, but none of them has come up with the cash we need to pay for all those news shots that are in there. So.
We had a website that we were flashing up. If people go to that website, they can get more information or track the progress of it?
Yes, they can sign up for a newsletter where they'll find out when it's available. They can get in touch with me about investing in the film with a great deal. And
that address is on the screen now.
So I'm hoping that it's going to be out there for everybody.
It's a necessary film, and it's certainly a needed conversation. Kevin, I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Now, when we come back, Andrew's got a look at how Donald Trump Jr.'s denial's falling apart. All of a sudden, that meeting that he said, okay, now it's all out there, Well, not so much. Even more Russians apparently were there, and one of them raising even more concerns that's really getting the attention of Congress.